London, a city of red buses and royal parades. But in September 2025, the chime of Big Ben could not drown the sound of another chorus. 150,000 voices, crosses raised high, crying, "Christ is King!" For 2 days, the heart of Britain trembled. Bottles flew, stones shattered glass, faith turned to fury. What many called a protest looked to the eyes of truth like something older, something darker, the spirit of white supremacy reborn, clothed in the garments of religion. And while Western leaders stumbled for words, a voice rose from Africa, clear, unshaken, young yet ancient in wisdom. Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso spoke not just of London, but of history itself. He said what others would not. That the same system that enslaved our ancestors still seeks to rule our future. Stay with us. Don't just witness history, help shape it. Subscribe, stand tall, and walk with us for an Africa that refuses silence. It began with banners and hymns. The streets of London, those same streets once walked by kings and poets, filled with men who called themselves defenders of faith. They came not in hundreds, but in legions. 150,000 strong. They carried wooden crosses like soldiers of some forgotten crusade. They shouted, "Christ is King!" as if the name of Christ could excuse their hate. At first, the world watched in disbelief. Reporters called it a demonstration. Commentators called it a cultural protest. But on the ground, it was chaos. Bottles breaking against shields, flares cutting through the smoke like angry stars. 26 police officers fell that day, 4 of them with broken bones and blood upon their brows. The man at the center of it all was Tommy Robinson, a figure long known for preaching fear against immigrants. Standing on a raised platform, he spoke not as a politician, but as a preacher of anger. His sermon was not of salvation, but separation. His altar was the street. His scripture was hate. And yet, behind him, thousands shouted, "Amen," men wrapped in flags, women clutching rosaries, priests with collars white as ash. It looked like religion, but it was not. It was idolatry of race, dressed in the language of holiness. Then came the moment that turned outrage into horror. A giant screen flickered on, and there appeared a face known across the earth, Elon Musk. Not the engineer, not the innovator, but a prophet of doom. His words echoed across Westminster. "Violence is coming. You either fight back or you die." The crowd erupted. Flares rose. Barriers fell. In that moment, the line between speech and blood was broken. Downing Street called his words irresponsible. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, tried to steady the nation, but his voice trembled between politics and truth. He said Britain was facing the fight of our times. Yet in all his speeches, he never spoke the words that mattered most: white supremacy. Because to name the sin is to face it, and Britain was not ready to face itself. As the hours passed, London, that proud city of empire, looked like a battlefield. Shops shuttered. Families hid. Mothers whispered prayers while smoke curled above the Thames. Muslim families in the East End closed mosques and community centers. One mother told the press, "We're scared to let our children walk to school." Her words carried the weight of history. From Birmingham in Alabama to Birmingham in England, the fear was the same. And still, the government called it unrest. The newspapers spoke of clashes. But those who lived through it knew better. It was not a clash. It was a calling, a revelation. The masks had fallen, and the system had shown its true face. History has a way of repeating itself, especially when the lessons are ignored. The crosses raised that day in London were not new. They were echoes of crosses burned in Mississippi, in Georgia, in the dusty fields where black churches once stood in fear. The chant, "Christ is King," was not about faith. It was about control. And the silence of leaders was not peace. It was permission. The irony was bitter. The empire that once claimed to civilize others now stood consumed by its own demons. The same nation that sent missionaries to Africa could not cleanse its own streets of hate. The same media that condemned African revolutions now softened the image of its own extremists. And so the question grew louder than the chants. How can a nation preach democracy abroad while white mobs rule its streets at home? That day, London learned that hatred does not vanish with time. It merely waits for a crowd. And yet, from another continent, far from the smoke and sirens, another kind of fire was being kindled, not of destruction, but of awakening. But while London burned in confusion, a voice rose from Africa, calm, young, and unafraid. A captain who saw in the riot not chaos, but revelation. While London was choking in smoke and denial, a different kind of silence filled the air over Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. It was not the silence of fear, but of focus, the stillness before a word of truth. Then came that voice. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, composed in his olive uniform, eyes steady beneath the weight of history. He did not shout. He did not flatter. He simply spoke, and the world leaned in. 50,000 white men chanting Christ is King, while striking Muslims and calling for their removal. This is the same ideology that enslaved our ancestors, the same creed that colonized our lands, the same system that still exploits Africa today. Those words rolled like thunder across continents. For the West, they were uncomfortable. For Africa, they were liberating. Because Traoré did what Western leaders would not. He named the truth. He saw in London's chaos not just violence but revelation. He understood that history was not repeating. It was continuing, wearing a new disguise. To him, those crosses in the crowd were not symbols of faith. They were warnings of memory. He recognized the rhythm of oppression, from the plantations to the pulpits, from the colonies to the boardrooms, the same melody played by different instruments. And for the first time in a long time, Africa did not whisper. It answered. Across the continent, radio hosts replayed his Ibrahim Traoré speech. Pastors quoted him in Sunday sermons. Students painted murals of his face beside Sankara and Nkrumah. In church halls, in mosques, in market squares, people said, "He spoke for us, for elders of the diaspora, those who marched for civil rights, who buried friends under segregation, who sang, 'We shall overcome,' with trembling voices. The resonance was deep. Here was a young African leader saying aloud what generations had known in their bones, that the struggle was never just about color. It was about power and the right to live free of another man's permission. And yet there was something else in Traoré's tone. It was not rage, it was resolve, not vengeance, but vision. He spoke not only to condemn the West, but to awaken Africa. He said, "If London burns in its own contradictions, let Africa build in truth." He reminded the world that Burkina Faso, whose name means land of upright people, was reclaiming that title, not through speeches alone, but through action, reclaiming its gold, its soil, its dignity, refusing to trade its sovereignty for applause. He said to his people, "We will no longer bow for aid when we have hands to work and hearts to build." And those words, simple and unpolished, became scripture for a new generation. To the young, he became a mirror. To the old, he became a memory of what leadership once meant. And to the West, he became a question they could not answer. Why does a young African speak truth with more courage than the leaders of empires? His message traveled further than expected. In Nigeria, scholars wrote that the Ibrahim Traore speech was a moral manifesto. In South Africa, youth movements invoked his name beside Mandela's. In Paris, the diaspora gathered outside embassies chanting, "Same system, different place." Everywhere his voice exposed a wound the world tried to ignore, that the hierarchies of race and power never truly ended. They only changed vocabulary. Where chains once rattled, now contracts bind. Where whips once cracked, now loans enslave. And where missionaries once preached submission, now media preaches dependence. Traoré called it plainly, colonialism in a suit. And his defiance lit a spark that no censorship could smother. But make no mistake, his courage came at a cost. Western commentators called him a populist. Diplomats labeled him a threat to stability. Yet for the people of Africa, and for those who still remember the songs of Selma and Soweto, that threat sounded like hope, because sometimes hope itself is a rebellion. And that is what Captain Traoré offered. Not fantasy, but faith made political. He gave a continent permission to believe again that leadership could be honest, that sovereignty could be sacred, that independence could mean more than a flag and an anthem. London burned for 2 days, but his words burned far longer, not with destruction, but with awakening. But the captain's words did more than expose hypocrisy. They ignited a global mirror, forcing every nation to see what it had long refused to face. When Captain Traoré's words echoed through the airwaves, the world looked into a mirror, and what it saw was unsettling. In London, politicians spoke of maintaining order. In Brussels, the European Union called for peaceful dialogue. In Washington, there was silence, a silence thick enough to hear the hum of hypocrisy beneath it. Because the truth was too heavy to carry in polite language. How could the same nations that condemn violence in Africa refuse to name white supremacy when it marched in their own capitals? How could a billionaire call for bloodshed and the guardians of democracy call it free speech? That silence, that hesitation, was not neutrality. It was complicity. For every headline that softened the truth, for every politician that said unrest instead of terror, another stone was laid upon the altar of denial. But Africa was no longer watching in awe. It was watching in recognition. They had seen this theater before, the Western stage where violence is judged not by morality, but by skin. In Minneapolis, a black man's resistance brought tanks to the streets. In London, 150,000 white extremists attacked police, and the world called it democracy in motion. To the elders who had marched in Selma, this was no surprise. They had seen how systems protect themselves, how justice bends when the color changes. But to the young Africans watching from Lagos, Accra, and Johannesburg, this was revelation. The illusion of Western moral authority was cracking in real time. News anchors avoided the word terror. Commentators spoke of economic frustration. But in Ouagadougou, the truth was spoken plainly. "The world you built is trembling," said Traoré, "and Africa must not build its house upon the same rotten foundation." And as those words traveled, they became both mirror and fire. In South Africa, youth movements carried placards that read, "Same system, different place." In Nigeria, professors lectured about the continuity of empire. In the diaspora, in New York, Toronto, Paris, voices rose together saying, "We are watching the empire implode," and still they call it progress. This was more than a political debate. It was moral revelation. For centuries, the West has written itself as the teacher, Africa as the pupil. But the London riots flipped the script. Now Africa was the one offering lessons on courage, on clarity, on conscience. And in that reversal lay something holy. Because truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid, and the truth was this, that the same system which plunders African soil still poisons Western souls. The Burkina Faso news carried images of school children waving the national flag, shouting, "We are the future, not the colony." In their eyes, the message of Traoré was not anger. It was inheritance. They were born in a world that called them poor, but they had discovered richness in spirit. Across the Atlantic, scholars like Angela Davis and Cornel West spoke on television, their voices trembling with righteous fire. "Oppression," they said, "does not disappear. It changes uniform. The same spirit that burned crosses in the South now hides behind words like nationalism and freedom." Western media nodded, but few truly listened. Because to listen is to confess, and confession requires courage. Meanwhile, ordinary people were not waiting for permission. Churches in Ghana held candlelight vigils, praying for London, but also for justice. Mosques in Kenya echoed sermons of unity, that faith without love is blasphemy. From Harlem to Harare, one message spread. "We see you, London, and we see ourselves in your struggle." What had begun as a riot had become a mirror, reflecting centuries of inequality, now televised for all to see. And the greatest irony? Those who had preached to Africa about democracy were now proving how fragile their own truly was. For when a system cannot name its own sin, it cannot heal it. And when nations choose silence over truth, they are not protecting peace, they are burying it. In the mirror of London, the world glimpsed its own face, cracked, weary, and stained with the same old lies. And yet, within that reflection, a new image began to form. One of resistance, of dignity, of rebirth. The kind of image that frightens those who live off the illusion of superiority, because this time Africa was not asking to be seen, it was seeing for itself. And so the question became not what happened in London, but what Africa would do next. Would it rise united under truth, or fall divided under silence? When the smoke cleared above London, the world turned its gaze toward Africa. For centuries, Africa had been the mirror in which the West sought to see its own greatness, the land of resources, the lesson in dependence, the stage for charity. But now, the mirror was facing the other way, and in its reflection, Africa began to see itself, not as broken, but as awakening, not as the student, but as the survivor, not as the past, but as the promise. From the bustling streets of Accra to the hills of Kigali, people whispered the same question. If the empire trembles in its own capital, why must Africa still bow to it? In churches, elders nodded. In mosques, imams lifted their hands in prayer. From Soweto to Dakar, the message was the same, that Africa's battle is not only against poverty or politics, but against the belief that it cannot stand alone. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words had planted a seed. He said, "We are not poor. We are rich in land, in spirit, in courage. What we lack is unity and the will to believe in our own power." Those words found home in the hearts of many who had lost faith in leaders, lost trust in systems, lost hope in promises written by foreign hands, and suddenly, belief, that quiet, almost forgotten flame, began to rise again. Because Africa's reflection was not just about the continent. It was about the soul of the black world, from Harlem to Lagos, from Kingston to Nairobi. a reminder that the same blood that built pyramids, that marched through Selma, that sang through slavery's night, still flows strong. But reflection alone is not redemption. Traoré warned that unity without purpose can become pride without progress. He said, "If we rise divided, we will fall beautifully and uselessly, but if we rise together, we will stand forever." The elders understood. They had seen it before, in the dreams of Nkrumah, in the fire of Sankara, in the courage of Mandela. They knew that independence is not a flag. It is a spirit, and that spirit cannot coexist with dependency. So the question now was not whether Africa could rise, but whether it would rise together. Because division has always been the colonizer's final weapon. And unity, real unity, is the freedom they cannot fight. But will Africa rise together? Or fall divided once again? The answer will shape not only the fate of a continent, but the conscience of the world. Africa stands now at the crossroads of history. One road is familiar, paved with debt, dependency, and polite submission. It promises peace, but it is the peace of the chained. The other road is harder, steep, uncertain, and lonely, but it leads upward, toward freedom. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has chosen the harder road. He walks it not with arrogance, but with conviction. Not shouting, but building. His vision is not for applause, but for awakening. He reminds his people that sovereignty is not isolation. It is dignity. For decades, Africa was told it could not stand alone. It was told to follow, to borrow, to beg. But now, from the dust of old empires, a new generation rises, one that would rather walk barefoot on African soil than ride in borrowed shoes from the West. This is not rebellion. It is rebirth. This is not defiance. It is deliverance. And the world is watching. Because when Africa stands upright, the balance of power shifts. When Africa unites, those who profit from its division begin to tremble. When Africa builds, those who depend on its weakness lose their throne. The Ibrahim Traoré speech was not just a reaction to London. It was a revelation to the world. A declaration that the days of dependency are numbered and the dawn of self-definition has come. He said, "We do not seek enemies, but we will not remain slaves." He spoke not only to Burkina Faso, but to every black soul across the globe that has ever been told to wait for justice. And his courage rekindled something ancient, the flame that burned in the hearts of ancestors who refused to bow. The road ahead will not be easy. There will be storms, there will be sabotage, there will be the seduction of comfort. But history has never rewarded those who play it safe. The crown of freedom is heavy, but it fits only those who dare to carry it. And so, as the echoes of London fade, the voice from Ouagadougou grows louder, calling Africa not to revenge, but to renaissance. A renaissance of spirit, of unity, of truth. Because every generation is offered a moment to rewrite destiny. This is ours. Because when Africa rises, the world itself will tremble. Not in fear, but in awakening. The riots in London may have lasted only 2 days, but their meaning will echo for generations. 150,000 voices shouted, "Christ is King," while striking their neighbors. And the world hesitated to call it what it was. That hesitation revealed the truth Captain Ibrahim Traoré had already spoken, that the system which once chained our bodies still seeks to bind our minds. In the aftermath, the Burkina Faso news carried images of schoolchildren raising their flag, chanting, "We will stand." Those children were not merely celebrating their nation, they were answering history. They were saying to the world, if the empire falls into confusion, Africa will stand in clarity. The Ibrahim Traoré speech now travels far beyond Ouagadougou. It is studied in universities, repeated in churches, whispered in market stalls, and remembered in the quiet hearts of elders who have seen this struggle before. He reminds us that leadership is not about age or wealth, but about the courage to tell the truth when silence is easier. And so, the call goes out once more. Africa, rise, not in anger, but in purpose. Rise, not to destroy, but to rebuild. Rise, not to prove your worth to the world, but to prove your faith in yourself. Because if Ibrahim Traore's speech taught us anything, it is this: freedom does not arrive by invitation. It arrives by conviction. And conviction begins with the decision to no longer wait. To the elders who remember the march from Selma, to the youth who scroll through these stories tonight, know this: your time is not past. It is present. The torch you once carried still burns, passed now to hands unafraid to build what you dreamed. If your spirit remembers the songs of freedom, don't let this moment fade. Like, share, and subscribe, not for clicks, but for conscience. Leave your words in the comments, because the story of Africa is being written anew, and your voice belongs in it. Together we rise. Together we rebuild. Together we remember that when Africa stands upright, the world itself stands taller.